So still going to interviews with clients to their green card, with their green card adjustment applications. The majority of my interviews are marriage cases, and still getting very positive results from offices. This week I went to a new immigration office that I had never been to before. It's the Cranberry, New Jersey office, which opened very recently. I want to say maybe 2 years ago. But it was my first time going there, and this Cranberry office is in central New Jersey. So um, you get scheduled for your adjustment interview based on the zip code where you live. And my clients lived within one of the zip codes. So, I had heard some things about the Cranberry office, some not so positive. So I was a little worried. Um, but we actually the interview got off to a rough start. The officer didn't identify themselves. Usually they, introduce themselves and tell you and your client, what their name is. And I thought it was strange, but this officer didn't introduce themselves, and they also didn't have their name displayed anywhere. Normally, most officers have their names displayed either on their doors or their desks. And I thought about asking it, but the interview kind of started off like not great. So I didn't want to kind of, I just kind of wanted to see where it would go. So the questions were a little hostile in the beginning. Um, for the first time in my 26 years of practicing, the officer asked my client why they never applied for a state ID. And to be honest, my client didn't really have a reason. She could have applied for a New Jersey driver's license a while ago and then never did. Um, I wasn't prepared for the officer to take issue with that. And when she asked my client, why don't you have a state ID? My client just basically said, I didn't know it was a requirement. Technically, it's not a requirement, right? There's no law saying you have to apply for an ID within X period of time of living in the state unless you plan to drive, which my client doesn't drive. So that was how the interview started. And then I got a little concerned, like, uh-oh, this is not a good sign. So then the officer kind of um, persisted in asking more questions about this whole question of like whether or not she lived in New Jersey. And I was trying to figure out where she was going with this. So the officer then said, well, what proof do you have that you live in New Jersey? And that can be relevant because USCIS field offices are supposed to schedule interviews with applicants that live within their jurisdiction. So let's say if I had a client who, when we filed their green card application, let's say they lived in New Jersey, but then after the application was filed, then they moved to another state, and then they never updated immigration by filing a change of status. If the adjustment interview is scheduled by a field office where the client doesn't live anymore, then technically that field office can just cancel the interview and then transfer it to the new field office that would have jurisdiction over the client's new address. So maybe that's the reason why the officer kept asking questions about this. Um, but basically, so my clients didn't have a lot of joint documents. The reason why is because she was living with her in-laws, not paying rent, didn't have any utilities in both in the couple's names. Everything was in her in-laws. So that didn't really help matters when the client told this to the officer, like I don't have that many joint documents. But what I did submit that was in the file was um my clients had at least filed their most recent tax return as married filing jointly, and that tax return did have the New Jersey address. So that was one proof. I also had my clients obtain signed letters from the in-laws confirming that they were living with them and not being charged rent and not paying for utilities. So I reminded the officer that those two documents were in the file. She took the time to review them, and thankfully, I think that satisfied her concerns. So after that kind of like shaky start, then the officer kind of loosened up a lot. Her demeanor changed from like not smiling and, very poker faced to a lot more casual. And then at some point she said something like, well, this is going to be a really fast interview because the I-130 was already approved. Um, a little background on the case. So when we filed the green card application, my clients didn't have a lot of proof of the marriage. We didn't have a lot of joint documents to submit at the outset. Um, so immigration issued a request for evidence on the I-130, asking for evidence that my clients live together, were in a bona fide marriage. So when we received the RFE, I kind of sat my clients down and I said, look, we really need to come up with some um, strong evidence that you live together and you're in a real relationship. So they didn't have a lot of documents to begin with, and I kind of came up with, brainstorming session with the client and telling them, look, you really need to start opening up joint accounts. Um, Immigration likes to see financial documents where both spouses are named on the accounts. They want to see that there's activity in the joint bank account. They want to see that you're contributing in your financial lives together, not that you have totally separate financial lives. So worked with the clients to come up with, a decent amount of joint documents. We responded to the RFE, and then very quickly after the RFE response was delivered to immigration, USCIS then approved the I-130. So that was a good thing. The officer saw that the I-130 was approved, and she basically just said, well, I'm, only going to ask a few security questions on the 485, which is the adjustment. And the interview was over in under 30 minutes, which I think is kind of a record. Most green card interviews take a lot longer than that. I would say close to an hour. But in this interview, I don't think the officer even asked for any documents. My clients, I told them to come in prepared with updated documents of their marriage, photo album, proof of traveling together. But the officer said that was unnecessary, and immigration approved their green card yesterday, which was great. So it just goes to show you that these interviews really don't they're really unpredictable. Um, I think that's the first time that an officer ever really zeroed in on and focused on the fact that a client didn't have a state ID. So that's just something to note. And another thing I noticed, I would say, is that every field office is different. Like the Cranberry office, my overall impression is it's okay. It's not as bad as I thought it could go. And then also the officers. I mean, first impressions are not always correct. I, I saw like the change in this officer from like really stern and strict to super friendly at the end, all from like the span of 30 minutes. So that was kind of interesting to know. It's like, it really makes me wonder, like, okay, with these immigration officers, like what's going on in the back of their minds and what kind of motivations do they have to ask certain kinds of questions? And sometimes you can't really tell. But yeah, it's just a reminder that officers are all unique individual people. They may, you know, focus on certain issues more than others and just always be on your toes and try to be prepared for any issues that could come up, which is all the more reason to have an attorney with you at the interview because you really never know what could happen. I mean, in my experience, the cases that keep me up at night, that I stress out over, that have like issues that I'm concerned about, a lot of the time they end up being the cases that, like the issues that you think will come up at the interview don't ever come up. And then conversely, the interviews that you think should go smoothly sometimes end up like not going the way that you expect them to. So, there's just so much variability with this whole process.